A common question that we get from a lot of people is whether or not they should follow their heart rate zones or their power zones when they're doing a workout. So I figured this is a good opportunity for us to delve into the pros and cons, kind of a power versus heart rate within the context of structured interval training. So let's kick things off first though by defining structured interval training so then people know kind of the realm in which we're talking about this. What are the basics on that, Chad?
So relative to each person's own fitness, we get a measure of that fitness. That's FTP, the functional threshold power. All the workouts are basically scaled to that level of personal fitness. And we do interval training, which means you work hard for brief periods of time, rest, and repeat.
Makes sense. That's so pretty simple stuff. And then let's get into heart rate, kind of the definition behind that. It's kind of basic, but heart rate versus power, Nate. Do you want to go into that a little bit in terms of what's being measured with heart rate and what's being measured with power?
Yeah, heart rate it's just how fast your heart is beating. And part of that equation that we don't have is how much blood is actually coming out. So a heart can beat really, really fast and not put out a lot of blood, and that's called stroke volume. Or it can beat really hard and pump out less blood. And that's how you see where you have two different people, like Chad and I, where I have a much higher heart rate than he does, even though we're putting out the same kind of power output. When you're measuring power, you're actually measuring the actual force output that your body, or the power output that your body is doing while it's cycling. It's repeatable, it's not affected by a whole bunch of things that heart rate is, and you can use that to compare two different people.
And so you mentioned force with power there, and that's the interesting thing with power is it's measuring not just how hard you're pressing on the pedals, because I think a lot of people might misunderstand that. They see somebody in a really big gear, so the legs are turning slowly, and they think, man, that's a ton of power. But that's not the case. It measures not only how hard you're pressing on the pedals, but how quickly you're spinning them over.
Yeah, it's the definition of power. So it's the how hard you're pressing with the rotation. If you're just pressing really hard and going very slow, you're not putting a lot of power. Or if you're not pressing hard at all and going super fast, you're not putting a lot of power.
Right, yeah, it makes sense. Now, one of the problems that we see with heart rate and why we advocate for people to just, if you have power, stick with power in terms of how you're structuring your work, is that it's subjective, right? And we've seen this a lot recently. We are up on Mauna Kea, up at a really high elevation, from sea level all the way up. And that was a great example of elevation affecting heart rate. What are some other things that you guys have seen affect your heart rate?
There's a lot of things. So just your level of stress, the quality of your sleep, your diet, your level of hydration, caffeine intake, the training stress, prior to the measurement, your level of recovery,
right.
A lot of things.
The time of day. I actually noticed too, if I do a block of training, let's say 1 week, at the beginning of that week, my heart rate will be higher during the same power output that I do. And then at the end of the week, my heart rate actually goes down more as I get more tired. But I can still do those repeatable intervals, and it still feels just the same. Like it doesn't feel any harder. But if I were to train with heart rate, I would not be hitting the prescribed wattage. I would be 30, 40 watts below. Yeah. Then when I rest up, the next week I'm a little bit stronger. Heart rate is really the same each time, but I'm seeing my power is going up each time.
Yeah, so that's the interesting thing, and it's different for each person too. Certain people, when they might be fatigued, they might actually see a different response for a period of time. Then maybe it's not a depressed heart rate, maybe it's actually elevated, and it can vary and go back and forth from day to day to a certain extent. So it's really tricky.
And I've actually seen it different in different times in my own training.
Yeah.
Where a few years ago, when I would get tired, sometimes it would be higher. And it would be really hard to put out that same wattage, and I would have a really high heart rate.
Right.
That's part of the frustration. There's no value in heart rate. It's now that we have a power meter. Like
right.
it's been out for many years now, and there's great affordable power meters. And to be able to have that repeatability with every workout
and objectivity.
That's a great way to put it. Objectivity, where variables don't input it. You can still look at those variables and have that advise your training if you want to, but it's not the guiding force behind your interval training.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. Like if something's going to guide it, it should be something that you can rely upon and isn't going to change from day to day.
Exactly.
Something else that in terms of how heart rates, the data that you get from heart rate is the fact that it lags compared to power. If you pick up your power output, it's instantly shown through the power data that you have. But your heart rate, it's going to take a while to ramp up. It basically, like if you have blocks for your intervals, let's say you're working for 3 minutes, resting for 3 minutes, working for 3 minutes, then you're going to see a very smooth heart rate line through there that doesn't represent the actual work you were doing.
Yeah, I think heart rate's really useful in terms of long-term trends, when you can take a step back and look at the data over days and weeks and even months.
Yep.
Same with when you tie heart rate to recovery and that sort of thing. But in the moment, especially when it comes to short-term interval training, it's not responsive enough.
Yeah, it's a really tricky thing. And in training juniors, a lot of the time, they have heart rate monitors because power meters are really expensive. And these kids are working super hard to get their heart rate up to where it needs to be. And a lot of the time what ends up happening is, let's say we're trying to get them to do intervals at the pace that they'll hold during a race. They start out way harder than that should be just because they're trying to pull that heart rate up to where it needs to be. And then thereafter, once it gets there, they have to really drop that pace down to stay at that point. It's really problematic, and it basically creates a situation that's pretty unrealistic in terms of actual structured interval training.
Yeah, and it gets exaggerated the shorter the intervals get too, and the higher intensity as well, which the two typically go hand in hand, short intervals, high intensity.
And Chad, if we're doing like a 10-minute threshold interval, that's exactly how we don't want to train. If we were training with heart rate, our power output would show that as we try to hit the target heart rate, we would go really high with power output, and then as the interval went on, as our heart rate raises, our power output would go down.
Yeah, and over the course of long intervals like that, especially ones done close to threshold, you would see over that 10-minute span that your heart rate would start to increase as your power stayed steady. So if you were working by heart rate alone, you would actually start to back off and you drop below the actual power target. The training stimulus might not be exactly what you were shooting for.
Yeah, along those lines, and I guess we don't have to get too deep into this right now, but when you mention training stimulus, when you work at specific intensities, specific adaptations or things happen in your body, and that's something that's tricky if you're using something that isn't exactly precise, then you can get into a spot where you aren't building exactly what you need to build. Yeah. Now power, on the other hand, it is subjective to one thing with power meters. It's an objective metric, assuming that you have a good calibration done, right?
That's correct.
If you don't have your power meter calibrated, and that's one thing that you can do regularly pretty easily, then you could be dealing with different data, but that would be it.
And I want to say one thing, the common term is calibration, but the scientific term is there's two parts of it. There's the calibration and the zeroing. And really in most software, when you click calibrate, what it's really doing is zeroing your power meter. And you can think of that as when you get on a scale and you push a button and it wants to find out what that level is where there's no force. So it takes into the account, like if it's crank based, the weight of the pedals. And that's the 0 bit. Calibration is something that's sometimes done at the factory or done with hanging a weight off it. It's usually not needed. If you're seeing crazy power numbers with your power meter, I would talk to your manufacturer and find out what the proper way is to calibrate your power meter.
Yeah, and I agree with talking to the manufacturer. I thought I knew how to do it, and I was doing it just fine, and then I had a problem with my phone, and it ended up breaking the power meter. So definitely talk to them on that. That's something you can do every day, and I'd recommend, I do it before every single ride, and it's not a it's not a painstaking process. It's really easy.
Yeah, it's database training, so we want to work with good data.
Yep, absolutely right. So I guess let's talk about how to use heart rate and how to use power meters. You mentioned something like trend analysis, basically. So heart rate variability, resting heart rate. We see it even for like heart rate decoupling. Basically, this trend analysis that looks at heart rate and tries to use it to get some insight into either fitness or recovery. And I guess the one thing that you just have to do is you have to keep that big old salt lick handy, not a grain of salt, but a big old grain of salt handy, in the sense that it's still subjective to the same things that you have that we talked about: illness, recovery.
Yeah, when we're talking about heart rate, it's just that. It's subjective. It changes from person to person, and within that person, it can change from day to day.
Yeah, and so within that, it's something to just keep in mind that although you may feel that this is like something that's really solid, it's still subjective no matter what. So kind of keep that grain of salt handy. Post-race analysis, I guess, is one way that I don't like to look at my heart rate during a race, because that can be really bad.
Yeah, let's get into that. I've tried that before I owned a power meter, and I've even done it while I race with a power meter. But if you look at your heart rate while you're racing and you have a certain heart rate goal, race day is totally different. You are amped up, right? And you probably have a different taper than most of your workouts. You might have had more or less caffeine than normal. Everything is different. You're in a different place. You may have a different elevation.
Yeah, you head into it in a wound up psychological state. So your sympathetic system's already revved up. Your heart rate's already elevated past where it usually subsides.
Yeah.
So if you try to hit those same targets, your power is going to be different. And someone might say, well, in this revved up state, shouldn't I be aiming for a lower target? Yeah. But I don't think the data shows that, is that you can people do more power in a race, even with a higher heart rate. And it's different than in training. Yeah. So I believe I actually don't race with a heart rate monitor at all, or my option is not to display it on my head unit because it gets in my head. And I say, my heart rate it goes both ways. My heart rate's too high right now. My heart rate's too low right now. And it gets in there and you get that self-doubt. Or if you look at the power, usually what happens in the beginning of the race, you say, whoa, I'm putting out more power than I should. Let me back that off and pace properly. And at the end, you're saying, ooh, I need to try and dig a little bit harder. Right, because the power's too low.
Put yourself in the shoes of one of our juniors at the Sea Otter Classic, a big race that they were really nervous about. They had audible alerts set up for their heart rate monitor when they got into their top zone. And he was in his top zone and he hadn't even started the race yet. So he was pretty concerned. But that's a good example of something that if you're really revved up and really excited, then it's just elevated that data to the point where it's
how the body works.
One thing I guess that, like you said, if you have that heart rate data post-race, you can look at it. But once again, and we're going to sound like a broken record here, but even with that, post-race, even if you're not looking at it while you're racing and everything else, but post-race, still keep that grain of salt handy. When you look at that power data, I guess that my point is when heart rate data brings power data into question, then that can get pretty tricky. That you might be making a mistake in that situation. But power, on the other hand, is pretty easy to use.
Very easy. Just one number that you're looking at, and it's usually, at least with TrainerRoad, you're looking at one target wattage that you're supposed to hit for each interval. Another common question that we get is, let's say we're doing 5 intervals of 10 minutes in length of each, and your heart rate will drift up after each interval. And someone will say, I'm outside of my heart rate zones, even though we don't prescribe heart rate zones, we prescribe power zones, but maybe they've trained in the past with heart rate zones, and they think, on this last interval, should I be lowering my power because my heart rate's getting too high?
Yeah, exactly. Energy conversion gets a little more expensive as we fatigue. So over the course of an interval, we become a little more inefficient. And as we become more inefficient, our bodies have to work harder to generate the same amount of output. So that heart rate, like I said, trends upward. And again, if we were training by heart rate, we'd start backing off and missing the point of the interval.
And you're probably missing a potential point of fitness gain, right?
Potentially, sure.
Yeah, those last intervals I find are like the things that push me.
Depending on how much you back off, you could completely miss the point.
Another way that you can use power really effectively is in pacing an effort. And while this might be a little bit more difficult in a variable race, something like a cyclocross race or short track mountain bike, something like that, in the scenario with time trialing or triathlon, it's super, I would say, easy to use.
Super useful,
not easy to put out the power perhaps, but easy to use in the sense that it's a great way to govern your effort, right?
Yeah, if you're a triathlete and you're not using a power meter, I would seriously consider getting one. What happens is once you get out of the water and you start on that bike and there's everyone around you, it's so easy to get caught up in that and put out more power than you should. And if let's say your plan is to put out 200 watts for a half Ironman, that first 5-10 minutes, when you're caught up in that, you might be putting out 240, 250, and it might feel really, really easy because you're so excited.
Right.
And then what happens then is at the back half of the run, you pay for that part in the beginning.
Yeah, sure. It's like any steady state race effort where you're just a little wound up, a little excited, and you go into it a little too hot. And that's the worst time to overdo it.
The common, the biggest advice is don't go out too fast, don't go out too fast, don't go out too fast for any time trial. And a power meter lets you not go out too fast. Right?
Yeah, it lets you make sure that you're actually doing that rather than just relying on maybe your perception of the effort or relying on, like we said, your heart rate's going to take some time to tick up and then over time it's going to keep creeping up. So how do you make sure you're really pacing it well without that power meter?
Yeah, exactly. It reins you in. So if you were to look at heart rate, you would go out too easily. If you were to base it all on perceived exertion, you would go out way too hard. But power tells you exactly where you need to be.
The majority of world records too for time trials are done with a slight negative split.
And can you explain that, what that means? Really quick?
What a negative split means is that the second half is slightly faster than the first half. And I know some people, especially in running races, I'm going to bank some time and then run at the end. That's not the fastest way to go. That's not how your body works.
Right.
And a power meter lets you really make sure that you do that negative split. If you were to rely on heart rate, actually the opposite would happen is as you are farther on in your race, your heart rate's going higher and higher. And then to keep that same heart rate, you'd have to reduce your power output, right? And you could try to do some things where you say, well, okay, I'm going to plan on getting my power, I'm going to let my heart rate tick up a little bit, but it's just not as precise as using a power meter.
Yeah, when you're talking about negative splitting, for example, like a 40K time trial, right? So that's roughly around an hour effort for a lot of people that are, trained cyclists. So they're looking at that about an hour. They know roughly what they can maintain for an hour. So when we're talking about negative splitting, we're not saying, 20 watts lower in the first half and 20 watts higher the second. it could be as much as 5 watts, right?
Subtle
It's
difference.
even less.
Even less, right?
So that's when we're talking about that level of precision. A power meter can help with pacing
It'd be
a lot.
pretty hard to come by if you were basing it on heart rate.
Yeah. Now, another way to use this for more variable efforts, at least personally I have, is in looking at my average or normalized power. And I can use that to kind of know how far out of my limits are. But once again, that's based off of past knowledge, stuff that I know from previous races and currently where I'm at in my training, how much I should be able to maintain. An example of this is like a solo breakaway in a race. If you're away by yourself and you're looking at that power data, you'll probably know after spending some time training with the power meter roughly how long you can sustain in the current circumstances.
What's realistic and what's unsustainable.
Yep. So it doesn't just have to be a fully constant time trial. It can be really helpful even in some other stuff.
Yeah, that's like a time trial within a race, because there's that initial break that you would do in a road race. Don't look at your power meter then.
Yep.
Go as deep as you can.
Yeah.
Then once you've established that break, you can look at your power meter, and if you're going 80 watts above your threshold, or even 20 watts above your threshold, and you have a 30-minute effort left,
Yep.
it's not sustainable.
That's when you recognize you're either not supposed to be part of that break, or you're going to have to figure into a different role. You're going to be the guy who's taking the short turns. You're going to be the guy who's sitting at the back for the long turns.
Yeah, it's a great point. And actually, let's just go right with that. Let's say you're in that scenario and you're in a solo break, or you're in a time trial, or a bike leg in an Ironman race, anything like that. Nutrition is something that's really huge, and a power meter makes extremely easy. So it's measuring work, and it gives you that work in terms of watts and kilojoules, right? You can see your exact energy expenditure in terms of what you're putting through the pedals. So it's really easy. There's no guesswork, I guess, when you're talking about pulling in all of that information about how many calories am I actually burning. It's pretty well known that heart rate data can throw you in a spot where you're going to be taking in way too many calories if you're trying to
when you're trying to match your nutrient intake to the amount of work you're actually doing, it's very hard to do that based on heart rate. It's quite simple to do it based on power.
And I want to say one thing is that with power, the thing that we don't know for calorie intake is a person's efficiency. Is that we're normally guessing that someone's 23, 24% efficient. They're 23 or 24% efficient, and that's kind of common across everyone. But it's the best metric we have, and much better than a heart rate based algorithm for calories.
And it's a very narrow range.
Yes.
Yep. Yeah, it is, and it can be super helpful just to make sure that when you get to the end of that race, you aren't deprived. You have enough energy, you have enough glycogen on board, whatever else you need, that you've got that in there.
And in the case of a triathlon, when you come off the bike, you're going to be able to run well.
Yeah, which is really helpful.
One thing I want to say is that a power meter almost predicts the future, because you can look at it early in a race and it's going to tell you, am I going to feel good later or bad later? Because if those numbers are high, it's going to tell you I'm going to feel bad later.
Yeah.
But if they're hitting your goals, or you're right around that, it's most likely going to tell you that in the future I'm going to feel good.
Yeah, and a lot of the time I'll go into a race and perhaps my mindset isn't exactly where it needs to be. Maybe I crashed early on, or I had a mechanical, or I just made some sort of mistake, right? And it's easy to get down on yourself in that time. And whenever you're down on yourself, the efforts seem to feel harder, right? But a lot of the time what I'll do is in that situation, even though I don't feel great, I'll be looking at that data and I'll be using it kind of as like a sign of hope, so to speak. Like, I know I can hold this. And sure, I may feel more tired today, or I may feel discouraged or something else, but I'm going to give it my best shot to stick to these numbers. Nothing crazy, but be conservative. And many times I've found that truth lies in the numbers rather than in my head.
Yeah, sure.
And it allows me to pull a little bit more from my performance.
Yeah. Perceived effort during a race relative to wattage changes. So you can get in a deep dark hole and you can look at your power meter and say, hey, I'm actually not doing so bad. Or you can be really excited at the beginning of a race and it's easy, and you look at your power meter and say, I need to rein things in.
Yeah, it's common. I mean, I see that in every workout that I do, right? Like in the beginning, I'm like, not too bad. I can do this. And then by the end, I guess I was a little over exuberant, right? So it's a good way of keeping yourself in check with that too. So let's recap here. In short, power is an objective metric as long as it's calibrated correctly, and it's a great tool to use for structuring your interval work. It's a great tool to use for pacing and also timing nutrition, right?
Agreed.
Making sure that you're on board with that. Now, with heart rate, though, it's objective in the sense that it does measure your heart, how many times your heart's beating in a minute, but it's subjective in the sense that what it implies in terms of performance, I guess, is what we're getting at, right? So it doesn't get at exactly what you're doing on the bike in terms of the work.
So in terms of heart rate objectivity, I mean, it is objective in that it's measuring your heart rate, but it's very subjective in terms of what that tells us.
Yeah, that's a great point. That's a good way to put it. So it's different than heart rate in that perspective, and something that we should, and I guess recapping too on this, it's a lagging indicator of that effort, right? Rather than power being one that's immediate, which really helps it.
Yeah, it's just not as responsive. It takes a little time to react. The body has to kind of wind up its resources.
So it's not that we're saying that there's no value in heart rate training. We're saying that now modern athletes have the ability to own, train, and race with a power meter. And when you compare those two together, we believe that training and racing with a power meter will make you faster compared to training and racing with a heart rate monitor.
Absolutely. So for more information on training and racing with a power meter, people can go to TrainerRoad.com.